content. I think it's important stuff to relay for you. I think it's very critical information that everyone in the payment security industry really needs to understand, especially as, over the last couple of years, we've all taken steps to try and address the e-skimming problem. I think it's really critical to understand what we're seeing, and our research team is seeing at, sort of the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, and giving you a snapshot of some of the evolution that we've seen in tradecraft and in the types of attacks and the campaigns that our adversaries are running. My name is Steve Ward, go through a couple of housekeeping things. Definitely want interaction. But phones are muted to prevent background noise. Use the Q&A or the chat window for any questions you might have. We are going to record the session. We will make the recording available to you probably within about 24 hours to share. The key takeaways that you're going to find from this discussion is that e-skimming attacks are not slowing down. They're actually proliferating, and we've seen some pretty sophisticated changes in tradecraft and the CTPs that are being used. Attacks seem to be gaining in sophistication, and I'll detail some of that as we get into this conversation. Attacks are unfortunately evolving to evade many of the controls and the scope that has been outlined inside the DSS, PCI DSS. That is a requirement that you guys are probably adhering to or working to adhere to. Some very important information around that, to convey. I think as a result, we've got ourselves in a situation where we might have somewhat of a false sense of security. I believe compliance as written, the DSS as written, may be sort of misinforming, our view on the world based on the research that we're seeing. One thing that's an important note is that we're seeing a change, not in a defocusing away from card data, but in an increase of additional forms of data being stolen in many of the campaigns that we've seen. And I'll speak to that as we go along with some examples. And one thing that we are going to be highlighting in an additional piece of research is that unfortunately, what we're looking at with e-skimming attacks is sort of a slow and low, almost advanced persistent threat kind of approach. And we've done some documentation on attacks that we flagged early in the year. We're going to be putting a new report out probably in a week to 2 weeks time max, that we'll make sure you all get. But it looks like persistence is really a problem, and that many organizations who suffer impact from these breaches, still quite some time later, are still falling victim to them. And so we'll talk a little bit about it as we go along. How to use this briefing, get general understanding of sort of like what we're going to go through. We're going to focus on real world threats. These are campaigns that we observed. This is research that was conducted by our teams. It's a tactical briefing grounded in current threat intel. It will get a little bit technical at times, but I'll try and keep it kind of high level to that. I don't know about you, but there are other people that are more technically adept than I am inside my organization. And what we will do is I'll cover the high levels. We have the research report itself. If you've not downloaded that, we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. I'm sure Scott can my colleague can put a link, in the chat for that, so you can directly download. And if you have questions that I cannot answer that go beyond my technical acumen, we can get into a conversation with other members of our team who just know the ins and outs of it a little bit more and better than I do. But we will cover some of the high levels as we go along. I'm going to speak some uncomfortable truths. I think there's things that, need to be said with respect to the current focus and status of where we are as a community addressing this threat. So I'll be a little, I would say, not sort of like confrontational, but you may find me not being all that political and holding back my viewpoints on a couple of key pieces. We're assuming that there's a baseline familiarity with e-skimming and the problems there, but I will do a quick overview, just to give you a general sense for anybody that's new to the subject, and then on the interactivity Q&A at any time. So ask questions as they come up. throw them over the wall. I'll try and address, any questions that I can. And like I said, if we can't get your question answered today, we can do some follow up on that front. Quick little background on who we are and, why we cover the space and, sort of like, our ability to even understand what's going on. We've been the pioneer in the eSkimming space, or what might be referred to as client-side security, for the better part of the last 10 years. We are an organization that is solely focused on protecting data at the point of capture, both from theft as well as from inadvertent leakage, which is becoming an increasingly large problem, where scripts and website partners are overreaching and are reaching in and grabbing data that might be data privacy mandated. So we cover both the compliance and the security aspects of protecting data as it's being entered into the forms that power our online commerce systems. We really are a web security firm at the true, heart of where you would put us. We think that, we're addressing a major, issue with third-party risk management, and, that we are, really truly helping to enable third-party service integration. So I mentioned data security, data privacy, data compliance. We address sort of all three of those things. PCI is sort of like the bread and butter of the conversation, if you will, because that's where we all are. That's where you are mostly. You're an audience of merchants and PSPs and QSAs and things of that nature. But our solution does also, and I know some of your organizations bridge into things like GDPR, HIPAA, and FFIEC. We are a PCI compliant solution under a SAC-D. We did a SAC-D with an AOC with IBM last year, and we literally just yesterday finished our additional SAC attestation for the 2026 calendar year. We are also a PCI PPO, so we're very active in the payments card industry, and in with the PCI Security Standards Council, and I myself sit on the PCI Board of Advisors for the 2025 to 2027 session. So we've got a lot of background in the space. We know what we're talking about, and one of the things that we do as an organization is we keep a constant eye on what's going on with respect to the threat. We're constantly out there conducting research, trying to understand what the adversary is doing to both empower what we do and also help inform the community. Um, on the real high level side of things, as I promised, if you don't know, what is eSkimming, what causes it, it really fundamentally boils down into the way that websites are architected today. Your website, your e-commerce, sort of experience, really isn't designed completely in-house. In fact, the majority of, the modern website that we interact with, given any different brand, is largely comprised of, a pieced together sort of set of services, some code that's coming through open source libraries, partners that do everything from analytics to chat to video to ads to you name it, all the things that sort of power the modern web experience are coming from outside partners. And as such, it is the, sort of outside, code that is running, or the JavaScript that these partners bring in, that creates a visibility concern, a security concern, and a situation where adversaries can take advantage of and use our trusted third-party relationships, to conduct e-skimming attacks for card data and other forms of data that they can monetize. It's really important that you understand, and we're going to set the tone for this, as we go through the research that we're going to talk about, that you understand that the JavaScript that runs on our sites is really powerful stuff. It kind of has no native security controls. It's like allowed to read and write and do things. It can basically change the entire user experience and change, the way the website is displayed. When compromised, it creates a really, powerful and dangerous situation. Page content can be changed. Adversaries can redirect, checkout flows, and they can change the way things are displayed. They can add content like form fields where, forms aren't meant to be capturing card data or PII, but they can manipulate them and add them there. They can redirect users or visitors, right, our consumers, to websites that are under control. They can put links in the flow that don't exist. They can record keystrokes. They can capture and exfiltrate card hard data and other forms of PII. So, the scripts that are running on our site are really powerful. They're from the third party. We don't really have full control over them. We don't have a lot of visibility into them. And our adversaries, when compromising them, can do a lot of really bad stuff. As a result, the PCI 4.0, standard, which was issued a few years back now, 2.5, maybe almost three, closing in, called for a focus on eSkimming controls. It's been updated to be PCI DSS 4.0.1 now, and the mandate was future dated. Now, if you've not done something, to protect against eSkimming, you are non-compliant, and you have been from as long as April 1st of last year. The standard itself speaks to control and visibility and monitoring of the payment page in particular. Okay. And so you'll see throughout the DSS, the emphasis is on, the payment page and protecting, sort of the last mile of the user experience and, where natively we would be capturing card data. And so they say you got to maintain an inventory on all scripts that are running on the payment pages and justify why they're there and confirm that those scripts are authorized and assure that the integrity is maintained and monitor the payment page headers for changes and alert and respond to malicious scripts as you would identify them on your payment pages. And I sort of set that previous slide up. And I emphasize the payment page focus here so that you can keep that in your mind as we go along and talk about the types of attacks that we're seeing, where adversaries are focused, and what we actually are and aren't doing to help secure our brands against and our consumers really ultimately against this threat. So keep that in the back of your mind. The scope is kind of isolated down to the payment page end of things. When we look at 2025 in its totality, really we assess it as like a year of advancement, of scaling and shifting in the TTPs, the techniques, tactics, and procedures utilized by the adversary. We saw tens of thousands of e-commerce sites attacked. These are attacks that were comprised of global focus, so they were not isolated to any one particular region. We saw an increasing focus on one-to-many attacks versus what I would say is like, a targeted whale type of situation. Mid-sized merchants, thousands compromised at a time, not waiting to sort of like break into Fort Knox with one major, sort of like global retailer, but yeah, rather taking advantage of, anywhere they can get their foothold, and hitting as many sites simultaneously as possible and taking advantage of the fact that a lot of us use the same services. There's ubiquitous services that are used. There's trusted services that we all rely upon, really playing into that to help hit, fast and hard and capture a big net versus sort of like a spearfish type of approach and focus. And so we saw attacks across fashion and apparel and travel and leisure and transportation and media, even government services, were under attack, by these types of adversaries in 2025. I'm sure there's dozens, if not hundreds, maybe thousands more than our team has the ability to get their hands on. But we saw 92 specific eSkimming campaigns in 2025. Those are the ones that we were able to observe, document, analyze. It's a lot, but God only knows, how many fly under our radar, and how many are active and, are underway today. And so I would emphasize if you are not yet minimal compliant, as the DSS frames it, you need to get moving because you are indeed, in an active threat environment, leaving your organization, susceptible to these attacks. We saw the compromise, and this was really a trend throughout 2025 of Google Tag Manager. It's a continuation of the theme behind eSkimming, which is, to attack trusted services, but really this sort of like continual focus on GTM or Google Tag Manager is something that I'll sort of break down 3 or 4 different examples of campaigns that utilized it, and it should be something that is pretty alarming because that's something I would say ubiquitously in the world of web and infrastructure management, everyone relies upon. So that was an alarming trend. Right at the end of the year in December, we disclosed an attack that was comprised of 52 different scripts, that had, what looked to be some pretty sophisticated attack infrastructure associated with it, and that signals what we, consider an increase in the sort of like commercialization, if you will, of this type of attack amongst the criminal underground, software as a service for e-skimming, and I'll detail that. So that was another alarming trend, and that's something we're still trying to get a little bit more deeper understanding of, and whether or not this is something that we will see, sort of pop off in the first quarter here of 2025, as a proliferation point, for additional attacks, and sort of like allowing other bad actors into the mix. As I mentioned, sort of a cast of the wide net. I think the largest example that we saw was 1,000 sites in one single campaign, attacked simultaneously. It's not to say that there were not thousands more, that shared similar, signatures, or that the adversary was the same within. But this speaks specifically to the fact that we saw a massive sort of rapid compromise of sites in one fell swoop. Sort of demonstrating like modern e-skimming operations are moving at industrial scale, at a sophistication, and with modular architectures that we have not seen, really in a large way, prior, to 2025. One thing of importance and real note, and back to that notion of that payment page focus, is we are seeing attackers target broadly across the entirety of the website. These scripts run everywhere. I mentioned what can happen if scripts are compromised. Scripts are not just loaded on payment pages. And because of what the adversary can do, if they have a compromised foothold anywhere on the site, they don't need to be on the payment page. And so there's a really big issue there that we've got to address, as a community, and that, hopefully I can, get you thinking about, with a high degree of, focus, by the end of this session. But yeah, across the entire site, operating globally, as I mentioned, not isolated to sort of specific regions. We're seeing a lot of languages being targeted. We saw 15 plus different languages targeted in one single campaign, with localized attack modules. So they're basically, trying to hit as many of your, in country, or as many of your sort of subdomains as possible, and they're indiscriminate in terms of the types of currency and the types of targets that they're going after. Geographies and payment platforms seem to be indiscriminate as well, and we'll talk about the payment platform side of things. We saw 10 different payment platforms specifically targeted or mimicked by attackers. Some of you have, any history with this subject might know e-skimming, to be synonymous with the term Mage Cart, because it was, Magento, or now Adobe Commerce, that was originally hit in the initial phases of these types of attacks about 10 years ago. And that was the threat actor name that was given to them by threat researchers. It does not seem to be isolated, and it is not isolated down. Every payment platform seems to be of, a target for these bad guys, and they're willing to do some pretty crazy things to help mimic, and hide their attacks. Many services weaponized. Okay. And so when I say services, I mean scripts, right? And so I mentioned Google Tag Manager, but so many others, that we saw, mixed bag of any one different type of script, or third-party partner, being hit. And very, very interestingly, a lot of legitimate services abused, not just for the attack pathway, but for, the masking of data exfiltration, and for the hiding, or for like obfuscation, to prevent detection. So we'll get into that. Okay. One thing, that this is to the sort of like uncomfortable truths part of the conversation. I think that, we would do you a disservice without bringing to the table, is our view that, based on the research that we're seeing and based on the knowledge that we have in this industry, PCI DSS 4.0, as currently written, is giving the illusion of e-skimming security. Okay. The compliance mandate itself, has some real significant holes in it that you need to be aware of, and that we as a member of the PCI PPO and a board of advisors are very vociferously we have been doing this, but for years, but this year very vociferously going to be sort of almost pounding the desk around. There's a misunderstanding of the threat. Experts in the space, ourselves, PFIs, not just vendors, but people in the card association, side of things, all up and down the chain, have been trying to provide guidance, to the council to modify the language in the DSS to not provide a false sense of either recommendation to address this problem in one way, or security that the scope is adequate. We believe the way it's written right now really relies on a myopic and static understanding of this tradecraft. It's kind of locked into 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, and it's got to change, and it's got to continually update and modify based upon what we're seeing. Because it's not, there really is misguidance that's being provided. And I'm going to dissect all of these things in further detail with the research to support it. We believe the wrong controls are emphasized, despite a chorus of warnings, a litany of voices that have said, you got to modify what you're telling people. We think that the focus is isolated and that it does not address the full attack surface. And we think that some of the things that were done, with respect to SAC-A changes and things of that nature, right around this time last year, mean that we're missing the point. We've descoped a critical target community. We've provided loopholes for some of the richest of targets, and we've created somewhat of a compliant shell game where, everybody gets the opportunity to just kind of pass the buck and only provide lip service to this problem as opposed to truly addressing it. And so in its current form, we don't think that the DSS delivers real security. And that's just, our responsibility in this space to say so. So let me break that down for you. And then I'm going to support this with the evidence from the 2025 threat report. Number one, controls that are recommended that absolutely do not control against this threat. Okay. Right now, if you go rip out the DSS and pull it out, you're going to see CSP, content security policy, and SRI, sub-resource integrity, mentioned in every single one of the reference examples in the DSS for controls against this problem. It leads to CSP-based or SRI-based solutions or even homegrown solutions being, largely adopted by merchants, and merchants going, well, I have the CSP in place, I must be able to take care of this. These controls are static. They're unable to track evolving JavaScript attacks. They're outdated. We had 80 people in the e-commerce guidance task force, which I was a part of, that spoke to the PCI Council, trying to get them removed. They were not removed. There was some language that was put out in a guidance document, that sort of stated that they alone do not ensure security. But, I don't think that's enough. And if people don't read that document, which is a subsequent, attachment, to the DSS, they're not going to see that. They are allow lists, okay, that operate, in sort of complete misunderstanding of the fact that it is indeed the trusted sources that are compromised. On the CSP end of things, there's a requirement for continuous updates. It creates breakage. There's a lack of behavioral awareness to what actually the scripts are doing. It's akin to saying, well, we really like that horse, so let's let it in. And it turns out to be the Trojan horse, right? And so I'll detail that as we go along. But the GTM, the Google Tag Manager thing, in and of itself, proves a concern. SRI requires hashing. Scripts are dynamic. They're constantly changing. They change by time of day, geography, user interaction, etc. You can't hash all of the files. And there's no detection capability as a result. Even one of the core authors, who was part of the PCI Council and has left and now works in the eSkimming community, has acknowledged that at the time that the DSS was written, he didn't understand how eSkimming attacks worked. And so the reliance on CSP and SRI, is sort of erroneous based on a lack of real true understanding of what's going on. So merchants are misled. There's a false sense of confidence. We've been saying this for quite some time. Scott, who's on the silent side of things, as my partner, he'll throw you a link to this one. It's a full in-depth analysis of the difference between like a behavior-based approach and unpacking and really understanding what scripts are doing and trying to control sort of like these allow lists or these blacklists and whitelists. Trust is the attack vector. Okay. Attackers are hiding inside these allowed paths. They are, exploiting our narrow view on payment page versus site. They are increasingly starting to attack more of the resurgence, I should say, back to first-party script attacks and actually breaking into server infrastructure and attacking scripts that you have that are homegrown. They are loading malicious scripts into repositories and using trust there to have you like inadvertently bring their malicious code into the software that you compile. They're attacking third and fourth party partnerships. They're weaponizing the very tools that are meant to enhance site functionality. And so, it's trust that's being exploited. And so using an old world viewpoint of whitelist, blacklist, trusted source, not, is really the wrong approach to this. I couldn't find where I wanted to put this like sort of side bullet. But one thing we'll go into and we'll talk about is the targets and the attack surface are changing too. It's interesting. Obviously, card data is what we're all meant to protect, and that's where the real value comes into play for the adversary. But they're increasingly targeting credentials during login and registration. They're going after PII across account management workflows. They're stealing, data that they can then use for credential stuffing and other forms of attacks and other types of fraud that they can conduct against merchants. And so I'll detail some of that as we go along. But, when we look at the research for 2025 and we look at the abuse of trusted services that would be allowed underneath an CSP, or an SRI type of approach, it should give us pause and say, okay, look, we've got to come up with a different way. Reputation-based logic is failing. We've seen, countless examples of, let's just break it down, like on the CDN and Edge platform side of things, Cloudflare, Fastly, CloudFront, hosting malicious scripts with high availability and trusted domain reputation. And so we're calling back into those scripts through our CDN and our Edge platforms, and we're consciously loading them in, not understanding that they are malicious in their nature. We've seen serverless and cloud runtimes where like Lambda and cloud functions in Azure are used as exfiltration endpoints with legitimate HTTPS certificates. And so when we're looking for, traffic to be exfiltrated, we're missing the fact that it's being hit in legitimate traffic flows. We've seen increasingly the use of GitHub and GitLab and JSFiddle to host obfuscated payloads that appear as legitimate code repositories. One of the more famous attacks was a couple of years back, which was polyfill.io, which was an attack where thousands, I think it was something to the extent of like maybe 60% of the internet was calling into this trusted repository service. It was a CDN to distribute that had been taken over by a Chinese crime adversary, and it was a service that we needed for website compatibility for older browsers, and it turned into a data skim and a malicious redirect that was being like consciously loaded but unknowingly compromised by the adversary. And we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing things like Slack and Discord webhooks and Telegram bots repurposed as data exfiltration channels with encrypted connections. And so, when we look at all of it and we say, okay, what are some of the key takeaways there? It's ignore this focus as provided in the DSS around sort of these whitelist or allow list, reputational kind of focuses, and focus instead on what scripts do, not just where they're loaded from, and focus in on behavioral analysis over domain reputation. Okay, those are some important key takeaways. Irrespective of who you use, like it's a hygienic thing that you need to be looking at. But let's get into like one of the Google Tag Manager examples. Okay, this is a pretty alarming intrusion path, like writ large. Like Google basically is trusted, right? We see this used for centralized control for rapid deployment because it's trusted, and also to create confusion and detection using complex chains. And out of all the campaigns that we looked at, of the 92, that we had out there for 2025, more than a third, or roughly a third, actually utilized Google Tag Manager as in attack pathway. So it showed up in over a third. We expect that'll show up in even more. It's a single point for injecting malicious code across all your pages. Okay, changes can propagate immediately without developer involvement. Since it's loaded from Google, it's going to bypass, security layers for whitelisting and blacklisting, right? And then this sort of stacking, this containers can load other containers, creating like layered attack opportunities. Okay. Let's like break into one example. Okay. So this is the chain attack example that we saw. So you had a legitimate container, basically an initial trusted, Google Tag Manager container that loaded normally. Okay. And then that called on a secondary container, which was compromised by the adversary. Okay, so the first container comes in, it's good. It calls back out, pulls in the compromised container from the adversary where the malicious payload is then delivered and the eSkimming code runs. Okay, so hiding inside Google Tag Manager, like you've got yourself, the Trojan horse, right? And that the compromised containers call on other compromised containers, creating like a multi-hop attack chain. And so when you look at like reviewing what might be there in the container, that's fundamentally insufficient for detecting threats, because they're going to mask it and they're going to hide and they're going to have the good guy call on the bad guy. And if you want to break it down into sort of a layman's kind of example, right? We saw direct container injection using Google Tag Manager as well, where malicious JavaScript was already inside the container code. It wasn't just loaded through tags or variables. It lived within the configuration itself. It's going to bypass tag level monitoring. It's going to appear legitimate. It requires us to rethink and really deeply inspect the content of containers, not just metadata. Okay. And so, we need to know things like who made the changes, when, what specifically changed. We have to have a history and a provenance, that becomes something that we track, with consistency as part of our hygiene here. Another one, a split delivery, where you had delivery phase, an assembly phase, and then an execution phase. So the first instance delivered a benign looking encoded data or configuration. Then coded fragments, which are stored in cookies or local storage or even DOM attributes, were used to assemble. And then the second instance assembled and executed the complete payload for eSkimming. So you need to be looking at runtime behavior. You need to be looking at what is actually happening with script execution, not just like static code analysis, right? It needs to be behavioral based. It needs to be something that is really understanding the sequence of events, what's loading what's calling on what, and what's happening inside each of those calls, in order for us to really detect a lot of the stuff as we go along. One of the things that we saw as a theme with respect to these particular campaigns using Tag Manager is that there's an ability from the adversary's part to control from a central repository, which I love, good command and control, and then to rapidly respond and switch their activity in response, right, to what detection might be happening. So we saw switching patterns that look like sophisticated infrastructure, almost similar to what you would expect in like an APT kind of environment. They're rotating domains rapidly. So every time a domain, gets flagged and gets blacklisted, they've got others that they can switch off. For the exfil side of things, it's not like some script kiddie that is just running, a campaign against organizations. There's organized crime involved. It's highly organized, campaign-driven operations that we're seeing, and even their use of Google Tag Manager, I think speaks to a level of sophistication that maybe didn't exist in this world 5 years back. Okay. Another reason that you need to not focus on reputational, and I don't mean just at the script level, but I also mean in terms of ways to detect other indicators of compromise, right? Like the actual exfil pathways is the new domains are being added for command and control and for exfil faster than threat feeds can keep up. Legitimate services, obviously, we talked about it being repurposed as exfil endpoints. Those examples that I gave, of those other services a few slides back. And by the time something is known bad, the campaign has moved on. And so the adversary is really looking at the persistence, as part of, sort of the new world of what they're doing in e-skimming attacks in 2025. Okay, need a real quick drink of water. I'm trying to keep us on track to let you out of here probably in about 10 to 12 minutes. Give me that. Another issue, that I wanted to address in sort of like continuing the speaking truth to power is the scope really misses the scope of the threat. Okay. And we've been saying this since I don't even remember when we published this thing with Coalfire, but it's probably 2 years ago now. Since we put out a report with Coalfire looking at the need to protect payment flows versus payment pages. Full stop after the sentence. E-skimming occurs site-wide, not just on payment pages. Payment page focus is a false sense of security. The DSS has the scope so narrowed down that we might as well not be doing anything related to e-skimming. And I'll say that in public forums, and I'll say that, to the people I know at the council. It's wrong. It's too narrow. It's too myopic. It does not recognize that attacks compromise upsite, and they compromise all these various different services, analytics, tag managers, personalization tools, not just payment forms. Okay. We did research with Verizon for the 2024 PSR, Payment Security Report. And one of the things that we looked at was like the 7,000, largest sites in the world, largest merchant sites in the world. And we found, 130,000 scripts, or roughly 40 some odd scripts running per page, right? Of the scripts that we found, the majority of them on non-payment pages. We still found a ton of them on payment pages, and the ones on payment pages were doing bad stuff, and they were uncontrolled, like accessing data, credentials, PII, things of that nature. But the ones that are outside of the scope of the DSS, and are not protected and are not, being monitored, are still being attacked. In fact, they're being attacked more often than not, as the primary point, for the adversary to conduct these types of attacks. Visa called it out. They've been calling it out for a couple of years. 2024 report, basically said it's the non-payment infrastructure that the adversary is going after first. So the DSS focusing solely on the payment, page, I just don't get it, right? And this is one of these things where, we're trying our best, and others in the community are trying their best too, to get this focus changed and to have you as practitioners understand, where the fallacies lie and what you need to do. Okay. iframe embeds do not stop upstream compromise. You might hear referred to as the referring page or the parent page. If the JavaScript is exposed and unmanaged elsewhere in the site, it doesn't matter. They don't need to compromise the iframe. And so we need to shift our focus away from payment page protection to site-wide protection. And, don't just take our view on it. This is like from Security Metrics, who've done 2,000 PFIs and forensic investigations, right? PCI forensic investigations. And they've said in 100% of the cases where they saw e-skimming occurred, the security failure was present on the merchant's referring page, the parent page, i.e. other places on the website, not because of a malicious script on the third-party hosted payment page. And so I just don't know how better else to say it. And then we saw this thing, happening in 2025, and I got multiple examples, to go through as well. That we call it the pizza method, right? Basically, completely injecting a new payment option into the website, and redirecting users. So a malicious script adds a fake payment method to the checkout UI. It appears like the legitimate payment flow. When the user, the consumer, clicks on it, they're directed to an attacker-controlled payment gateway, which, by the way, is like mirror imaging, like a Stripe checkout or any other form of checkout, right? To make it completely, non-obvious to the consumer that they're being duped. They steal all the data there. They collect the payment card data, including the CVV, and then they present a convincing checkout experience, and then they redirect the user, on submit back to the merchant, and then they give them a payment failed error, so that the consumer re-enters their data, so that they still get the product that they were after. Right. So, nothing is broken in the consumer experience and nothing gets flagged. Okay. This should alarm anybody whose sole focus is only on payment pages. It really should also alarm people who say, we're fine because we outsource the payment page. Okay. So we're immune to this. We're descoped. It's a hosted payment page. It fully redirects. We don't have to worry about this. It's like, saying that, in the physical world, you're not responsible for the security of your parking lot. Okay. Somebody gets shot outside the store. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we had, no lighting. It doesn't matter, if we've allowed, an environment of an insecure environment to exist outside our store. It may be on our property, but it's not our problem. It's going to be your problem to the consumer. It's going to be your problem somewhere, in brand damage. It's going to likely be your problem as it relates to, class action lawsuits. And it's just our problem as professionals. Like we have a duty here, and if we're just compliance people and not focused on the root of why we're doing compliance, then like it's all for nothing. It's all just smoke and mirrors. And so, I call this out and I say, especially given like the non-significance or the sort of like triviality of the expense between going from a payment page protection to a site-wide protection. It's like not doing it is like almost malfeasance, okay? Especially against, what we're seeing with these types of attacks. We also see, things you call silent skimming. We saw a bunch of this, more so than the double entry attacks actually in 2025. There's no visible signs, there's no pop-up, there's no overlay, there's no obvious formula manipulation. It's completely invisible to the user. What we see is, there are event listeners that basically intercept submissions, and that stage the captured data in cookies or local storage so that it's, hidden and won't be seen and can be later exfiltrated on larger navigation events. And it leaves no trace of manipulation. You're not seeing a fake form. There's no visible indicators that it's happening. And detection, either requires, full behavioral protection of all forms, or, looking at all the data exfil patterns and looking at outbound connections, not just looking for, obvious signs of site manipulation. The double entry attack is one that, I think most people are familiar with. And I think this is where some of the, sort of like false focus on just payment pages came from, because these are effectively like overlays over legitimate checkout flows. But we're seeing this at industrial scale with hundreds of compromises per campaign. We're seeing that they're not just isolated, to any one part of the world or anything like that. There's legitimate payment providers interface has got a pixel perfect representation that looks, completely like what the consumer is supposed to see. In this case, the consumer has to enter their details twice. It looks like once failed and once come back, and they got to re-enter. In that regard, there are some at the council level who believe, these are more detectable because you're going to get consumer complaints that say something's off. But I don't really buy that, too much, because there are many times I think it's my internet that's caused problems, not the website. And there's many times where, I get duped into doing things twice, three times, etc. I think there's another thing I want to emphasize as we get closer towards me trying to shut up and get you guys back to your day. It is that I believe there's a bit of a shell game that's still being played. I think that as I mentioned, some of the critical concerns, there's an issue with how the council changed scope for SAC-A, and it has caused a large portion of the merchant community to not do anything. And it has, I think, really left, what we consider to be increasingly the target point for the adversary, the mid-sized market, to sort of be, remain unprepared and uncontrolled. So a couple of months before, the deadline, they made changes to the SAC-A eligibility. Effectively, it was supposedly done, to help make things easier for the smaller merchant. A lot of people just paused their compliance programs completely. Some did still don't think that they're in scope, and they don't have any requirements for control. There's QSAs out there that have differing opinions. What we heard, through all the direct conversations that we had, is that it was ostensibly being done to make, compliance easier for the level 3, level 4 merchants, the smaller, the mom and pops. But those are core targets of e-skimming attacks. And, there are a lot of level 2 merchants that, fall into SAC-A eligibility. Also, I think it sort of exposed a real problem, and that's why I call it kind of a shell game between those that write the standard and those that manage, or are the compliance reporting entities, and the card associations. There's knowledge is not being shared with respect to how compliance is actually achieved and documented, and what types of merchants use what types of sort of like loopholes, if you will, within the DSS. As a result, the council doesn't really understand that a large level of number of level 1 merchants have long been SAC-A reporting for their e-commerce channels. And so we've got like this big, target surface that's left exposed, i.e. the mid-size and the small. And then we've got like these whales that like are able to play the game because, they're SAC-A and they don't have to do anything. It undermined the uptake. We need to change it. We were really loud about getting the 1588 guidance done. We think that did modify things a little bit. But all of us in the council's like e-commerce guidance task force were like, "What are you doing? Don't do this." QSAs threw up all over it, whatever. And it just leaves like too much of the world exposed, where the bad guy like pays attention, right? And that's when they get into like sort of industrializing and turning e-skimming into a service, and making this, sort of like an ability to like launch wide scale, almost, consider it sort of like, intercontinental attacks, right? It leaves open so much of the sort of like the attack target for them, that isn't even going to be able to catch this stuff. All right, now I'm going to transition to a couple of other interesting things and get off the soapbox that we saw. I did mention, the industrialization. We are seeing e-skimming, moving into, this is what we saw at like sort of the tail end, modular loaders, interchangeable components, geo-targeted execution, like almost operating like commercial software as a service platforms. So, the loader side of things, like a core injection framework deployed across compromised sites. So like, almost like just, press and launch, right? Tailored modules loaded based on target characteristics. So like load this module based on this geography, or load, based on, any number of different target characteristics. Also, sniffing and understanding what type of controls are in place, and modifying the load based upon that. Region and provider specific payloads delivered dynamically. We're seeing multiple languages being used, currency being used, regional payment methods being targeted, payment providers from Stripe to PayPal, Braintree, merchant platforms from Magento to WooCommerce to Shopify. It's not just a collection of one-off injections. It's a scalable attack platform that people are investing into the infrastructure behind, are versioning, and are even like running maintenance cycles against. So that's pretty alarming. And I think, that's where things get ramped up in 2026, especially with this, sort of like portion of the target community, still kind of not protected. We've seen WebSockets being used. for persistent adaptive delivery. And so what it gives them the ability to, load code in real time and deliver in real time, the ability to use event-based triggers, using fallback communications and establishing fallback communication channels if one primary channel should fail, basically creating like persistent backup capabilities for themselves, as well as like, even falling back to the communications to C2 channels by rotating through multiple domains, multiple protocols. And so, being able to block one known bad connection doesn't stop the attack. We've also, seen the localization, the use of verification deception, dual exfiltration, and other conditional triggers. So localization, like adapting to user language, currency, regional payment forms, displaying familiar logos specific to that region, something that creates familiarity and, what I would say, like, helps hide the counterfeit nature of what they're doing. Terminology, field labels that match and don't seem out of place to the consumer. Using, fake verification, fraud prevention messaging, security verification steps, getting users to believe they're completing authentication. We're seeing more and more of that. Conditional triggers, especially ensuring that not every user is attacked. Like they want persistency here and they want to fly slow and low. So they're not going to just like on one given day hit the million consumers that come to your website and steal all the data from every one of them. They are selective and round robin in nature in terms of how the targeting and how the attack works, so as to maintain a lower profile. And then we're seeing things like dual exfil, where a combination of compromised legitimate sites, right? Where they've effectively like taken over a good domain, and malicious infrastructure being used as part of the payment pathways or the flow pathways for the exfiltration. I mentioned earlier, we're seeing an increase in other types of data theft. And it's interesting, I mean, again, obviously card data is what we're here to protect. But when we look at, again, the need for site-wide protection, we're seeing more and more attacks that target registration, login, account management flows, loyalty pages, not just payment pages. They're looking to steal, authentication and other forms, of information that they can use for either future account takeover, or to aid in broader identity theft, by getting a complete profile on the consumer that they just hit. So it's not just the PCI data, is the PII data, and also then using for credential stuffing across other services. So downstream attacks or lateral attacks, and really fueling the underworld, and monetizing, being able to monetize more off of a single compromise than just card data. We're seeing, I mentioned persistent mechanisms, where we're seeing like rogue admin accounts, so backdoor access for recompromise, persistent code injection into CMS for database manipulation, putting compromised plugins and dependencies in place. We're seeing anti-forensic techniques being used. So scripts that identify the security testing, and patterns and sort of run through and make sure that there's sort of like anti-detection capabilities. We're seeing in many attacks, we saw the use of actually like using a legitimate API back to the PSP to verify the validity of card data before they bothered stealing it, so as to make sure that they are getting something that's usable, and B, avoiding any traps that may have been lying in effect for them, across other sort of like anti-fraud type of capabilities. A lot of different evolutionary things that we're seeing there. At the end of the day, the takeaway is the threat's getting worse. It's not getting better. We are seeing evidence of bypassing and evasion of controls. We are seeing gaps in compliance that are providing a false sense of security. We need to expand, our view on this world. We need to, educate ourselves more around what's going on, and we need to keep a constant, view on what the adversary is doing. We're hearing from the card associations this is a primary form of fraud. It is a source of fraud, and so, it behooves us all to kind of like know more, do more, and think bigger. We think in 2026 you're going to see more as a service operations. We think more of the digital supply chain will be targeted. We think that you will see more of a focus on stolen credentials and identity. And we think that there will be more adaptive overlays that will be placed for context-aware form manipulation. Now, that was a lot to cover, and I've been talking for forever, and I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to go to the thank you. My name is Steve Ward. I'm Steve at sourcedefense.com. And I want to make sure if we have any questions that I answer them. So I'm going to take to the chat window here. It looks like Scott's been dropping a bunch of stuff in there. Are there any questions, from any of the stuff that I've just been talking about, or are there any objections to any of my viewpoints or challenges that you want to talk through? I want to make sure you get, out of this last couple of minutes, anything you might be needing. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to put my email address in and there's me. If you want to reach out to me, absolutely can. Oh, hang on, Scott. I'm not sure if that went to, I don't know if those links, yeah, anyone. Yeah. Okay. Hang on. I'm going to change the, I can't send it. Scott, if you could put my email address in the thing, it'd be great. Um, all right. I don't see, hang on. There's another notice there. Q&A. Hang on. Okay. Okay, is there any hope that PCI will adapt to this grid? I don't know. I think that we're all members of this community. The question is, do we think that the Security Council will adapt, to change? I would say if you look at the evolution of PCI over the last 20 years, adaptation is always something that comes. I would say it comes slower than it needs to. I would say that even the inclusion of the focus on eSkimming controls is probably a few years too late. I would hope so. We're all part of this community. I think it's behooves us all, no matter what our role is, either at the merchant level, the QSA level, the merchant acquirer level, all the way on up, to have this conversation and to have it, in public and to try and get people's attention on the problem. Okay. The presentation notes that iframes don't stop upstream compromise. Parent page JavaScript remains exposed. That's correct. In cloud environments with microservices and containerization, what similar false security patterns should auditors watch for where segmentation looks good on architecture? Okay. So Charles, this is going to be in one of those. We should take it and get you synced up with a guy on my end named Matt McGurk, because he's going to be able to dissect that deeper and faster than I can in the minute and a half we have left. It's a great question. And I'm sure that he has better technical, thoughts on it than I probably could offer. So let's do that. I think that the root of the question is one I really love is, what should auditors watch for, right? And, to better understand like actual risk, versus what looks good on diagrams. I think that's a core role of QSAs, and I think that it's something that like I'm glad to see the question being asked because that's what part of this presentation is about, right? Is helping you understand the true nature of what's going on, so you don't just come in with a rubber stamp, but you come in as an advisor, and providing real guidance to your clientele. So I'm going to slack that to Matt. And go from there, and we will get back to you on that question. Yeah, so there's a comment that um, the SSC is probably not going to change until there's some pretty big financial impact, that people have. I think you're probably right, unfortunately. But, I'm one of those guys that is not going to stop, shouting at the clouds. And for all the right reasons, hopefully. And so we're going to be out there trying to affect change as much as we possibly can. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's this that, that needs to be understood. Compliance says one thing as a requirement, as a floor, And we don't have to take what's written in the DSS and say it stops there. If we know and we're aware and we inform ourselves of, the gaps that exist between real world, the real world of threat and the compliance world of, controls that are typically past dated, um, well, then we can do more, right? We can do more. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you. We're at the top of the hour. I want to make sure you get time to get back to your busy days. We're